to the cloud. I'm going to share my screen, desktop 2, share. Okay, so here we are at How Come Broadway. How come Broadway? And why are we talking about Broadway? Even though, many of us don't necessarily desire Broadway careers, it's known as the sort of most commercial wing of American theater. To me, it's really, really important to know about Broadway and its sort of industrial, economic, social, and cultural history as a framework for understanding the economic, social, and cultural history of theater as an art form on this planet. And also, really, I argue that you can't understand the sort of radio industry, the TV industry, the music publishing industry, as well as the sort of music recording industry, film and TV. I don't think you can understand any of these without understanding some of the sort of primary axes of the history of the entertainment industry in the United States, which has been a lot of its energy has been centered on New York and specifically Midtown. Okay, so these are the slides from last time. I'm going to go over them super quick, partially so that Kevin can see them and just to remind us what we talked about. So it's Broadway now. Broadway, what is Broadway? It is a place. It is 41 theaters in right now. It is 41 theaters in Midtown Manhattan with 500 seats or more within 2 square miles. So it is a place. It is definitely a place, and it is also definitely an industry. It's an industry that has been going up in its sort of economic impact since the 1980s, although as we'll talk about today, it's been up and down all over history. And it's an industry that is sort of regulated by a bunch of different unions and organizations, just like any other industry, right? The steelworkers have a union, the actors have a union. So we talked about sort of New York theater and performance art as a function of population density, looking at it as this sort of incredibly populated place. We talked about settlement and how colonization happened, in the United States from east to west. So New York City was a site of very, very early colonization, first by the Dutch and then later by the British. That circle is around Midtown Manhattan, where the Broadway ended up, which once upon a time used to be a beaver pond. So whenever I go to Times Square and I'm looking at all those shiny lights, I always think about the beavers who were displaced. So how did this all happen? I talked about the disenfranchisement of Lenape people. Lenape are part of the sort of Delaware tribe and the series of forced migrations as they were moved across the country in totally unfair ways after some really terrible sales and treaties, first with the Dutch and then with the British. The Dutch hated theater. I don't think I said this last time, but literally for the Dutch religion, theater was like illegal and unchristian. So there was no theater when it was just Dutch settlement. And then the Brits came in, and the Brits were more fond of theater. Thank you, Shakespeare. So that definitely happened. Here was near current Times Square, Manhattan in the early 1800s. It looked like the country. And then this guy who was Mayor Cornelius said, move uptown, enjoy the pure, clean air. And then people did. I love this picture, 1868. It looks like the Old West uptown New York, even though downtown had paved streets, but Midtown did not. Then what's now Times Square became this less than remarkable strip catering to horse dealers, carriages, and stables, but you can already see that burlesque theater up in the corner there. So theaters were already starting kind of to happen around there, but more of the theaters were downtown. So this is a picture of Niblio's Opera House, which is downtown. Entertainment at the kind of big, fancy opera houses really peaked after entertainment business boom, particularly after the Civil War, which makes sense. The wars have had a lot of impact on the theater industry sort of in general in this country. The downtown theater, it was actually still on Broadway, but farther downtown. At that time, it was where the high class theater happened. So it took a long time for the sort of transition from a downtown to the uptown theater to happen, and it had a lot to do with class. Has anyone ever heard of the Astor Place riots? Raise your hand. Astor Place riots. Okay, we got rid of our theater history class in this major, so I feel like this class has to do 17 things at once. One of them is theater history. The Astor Place riots, I'm not taking a long time to talk about them because it was a little farther back in time than we're focusing on. The Astor Place riots happened in sort of the downtown theater scene, and it was literally a riot over whether a British guy was better at playing McBee or an American guy was better at playing McBee. I think it was McBee and not Hamlet. Maybe it was Hamlet. Someone should Google this. But the Astor Plates riot was basically an anti-British, pro-American riot that happened where people were so angry about Macready, this British guy playing either Hamlet or McBee, I forget which one, that they like pelted the theater with stones and climbed the side of the theater and were like freaking out. And the Astor Place theater had to be shut and demolished because they kept jokingly calling it the disaster place. And like, anyway, that was one of the reasons why theater moved uptown, because the Astor Place riots had been very dramatic. So I was talking about some of the plays that were happening downtown prior to the development of the kind of Midtown, Times Square, Broadway scene, and these are some of them. Black Crook is sometimes thought as one of the first musicals. A Trip to Chinatown referenced Chinese culture without having any Chinese people involved. And this poorly named show, A Trip to Coontown, was the first one of the first fully produced, written, and performed by African American actors show to ever happen in New York City. It ran very well. And then there were three major urbanization changes that brought about Times Square. They were electric light, subway, and the newspaper building. I think this is where we stopped last time. Is this where we stopped in the last lecture? Anybody remember? Maybe. Okay. So these were the big changes that kind of made the Broadway space and place kind of what it was. And it was the invention of light, electrified light. Basically, Times Square has always had the most cutting edge electronic light technology ever since the 1880s. They were the first to get streetlights. They were the first to get neon. They were the first to get LED. Whatever is the newest, most expensive electric light phenomenon of an era, Broadway has it first. Times Square has it first. And Vegas. Times Square and Vegas have it first. And then it sort of spreads out to the rest of the world. So had I gotten to this slide yet? Did I talk to you at all about Oscar Hammerstein the First? Did we talk about him? Okay. So there are lots of theaters in the Broadway area. They get built and used and remodeled and changed and shut down and torn down and built and remodeled and changed and shut down and torn down. One of the reasons why the Broadway area is what it is because there are just so many damn theaters in one area, right? We talked about how in Memphis we only have 2 theaters over 500 seats and they're 20 miles away from each other, right? There's like the Orpheum and a GPAC. They have over 500 and all the other ones don't, and they're very far away. And of course, once a city has already built up, it's hard to then just like build a theater district in the middle of it because theaters are huge. It's not like a hole in the wall sandwich shop. You need giant buildings like this. So if you don't already have a space that has a lot of big buildings that can be used for entertainment in it, it's really hard to just, make that happen, especially in the center of town. So Broadway is a place, it's an industry, it's also literally a collection of very large buildings where people can gather together that have been alternately protected and torn down and thrown away and unprotected over history, depending on the kinds of whims of cultural and historical forces. So this is one theater that kind of helped turn Times Square into the like hopping, crazy, wild place that it is today. This is Hammerstein's Roof Garden. This is Oscar Hammerstein the First. He was a German Jewish immigrant and a producer businessman he was literally the term impresario. He was a theater impresario. This was a thing that people used to be. They would manage everything of the theater, from the choosing of the spot to the choosing of the shows that were going to be in it, to the choosing of the actors who were going to be in it. So he was an impresario. He had just lost a whole bunch of money on another theater, and so he built this one to like sort of show up his enemies, and he called it the Victoria because he was the victor over his enemies by starting another theater. Lots of feuds between these theater impresarios. So, oh yeah, and this particular building I think is really interesting. It tells a lot about the process of Times Square. So in the 1800s, it was horse stables. And then when he built this theater, he actually didn't even tear it all the way down. He like kept some of the interior walls from the horse stables. So there was jokes about how it would smell like horses in this theater because the interior walls still had the remnants of the former building. Hammerstein was he was from Europe and he was very Euro oriented, and he thought that the way to make theater good in the United States was to bring in more what they called legit theater from Europe. So this is legit theater was literally compared to not just musical theater, but compared to sort of burlesque theater, vaudeville theater, things that were less formal, more amateur, and also more sexy. Legit was a way of saying not too sexy. If you come to our plays, it won't be too bad for your kids. So it went from being horse stables to being legit theater, 1899. Turns out this theater could not make a profit doing legit theater, so he handed it over to his son, William Hammerstein. And William Hammerstein was like, you know what makes money? Vaudeville. Vaudeville makes money. So he changed the theater over to vaudeville. We'll talk about that more on the next slide. And then they sold it in 1927 or something, and it became a cinema house. So I think this is a really good display of kind of what happened to theaters in Manhattan. Horse stables, legit theater, vaudeville theater. So Victoria Theater had a roof garden, and the roof garden was like basically a huge wild party scene. Roof gardens are still the best place to party in New York City. And they definitely were back in what this is sort of called the Gilded Age of Broadway. This was before air conditioning, so life was very, very difficult before air conditioning. And there was this, they advertised that it was, there was good airflow and that it was very cool up there on the rooftop. They found out later, they took a thermometer. In fact, it was not true because of heat rising and the heat of the building. It was actually hotter on the rooftop than it was on the street. So in order to still encourage people to go to there and find it cool, they came up with this great technique to overheat the elevators. So you'd get in elevators, you'd be sweating, and then you'd come up on the roof and you'd be like, oh, it's so cool up here. I just love that story because I think it tells you a lot about the kinds of business minds that were working at the time. It wasn't about high quality entertainment. It was about making a buck and how you draw people into sort of your space. So there's a lot of vaudeville entertainment here up in this roof area, including troops, international troops like this one, which was a sort of international like wrestling and acrobatic team. I thought that was very cute. And this quote, I think, says a lot about the culture at the time. So Times Square came to be seen as the capital of fun, the place that instructed the nation in the fine art of play and furnished the dreams of young people languishing in what was called in the newspapers Dullsboro, so like boring America. So Times Square became like the party central where you wanted to go to get out of your small, dull, boring town. So the Victoria, this particular theater started out with kind of legit theater and musical comedies. This is one of their first show called A Reign of Error. And then they also did vaudeville. So vaudeville, raise your hand if you know anything about vaudeville or have studied vaudeville at any time. Anyone here? Kevin, Eliza, cool. And let's see, Annalie and Eliza, you're both in I Love You, You're Perfect Now Change, which is absolutely in the style of American vaudeville. So American vaudeville here on the right, we see a program for a vaudeville show. So there would be somewhere between, there would be like 9 performers usually, and it's all different styles of things, music, comedy, freak shows, dancing, and then of course America's favorite pastime for a long time was blackface. So you see down here Al Jolson, the most famous blackface comedian. So we're not going to take a lot of time going into the sort of history of American blackface, but I think it is safe to say that the sort of the impact of blackface cannot be underestimated, and that the ways in which racialized enactments of class and educational prejudices specifically on the American stage are just deeply embedded. And all of the questions that we're talking about in this class about what kinds of shows we want to do and why are all in response to a very long and incredibly painful history of racial caricature on our stages. So anytime we have racially specific characters on stage, understanding how that characterization relates to like the long history of racialized performance is pretty important. Yeah, so here we have musical comedies and vaudeville. So the other thing about vaudeville is that it was a circuit. So this particular theater, Hammerstein's, it became one of the biggest vaudeville stages in the nation. So if you said I performed at Hammerstein's, you were like awesome. Hammerstein's Victoria, you were awesome. But usually what would happen is you would then go out on tour. So this is the Orpheum circuit, which was usually different than the Hammerstein circuit. But if you got signed to the Orpheum circuit and you were on a vaudeville show, you would basically go to all these different theaters across the country, going on these new train lines that had, went from New York to Chicago all the way across the country, and your whole vaudeville troupe would go with you and perform through the country. So this is a vaudeville circuits were really the first like mass American entertainment. prior to radio, prior to TV. The vaudeville circuits were essentially variety shows. Sometimes they had a little bit of a competitive edge, kind of like America's Got Talent. Like there was often an amateur slot for someone from that town. So if you were in Des Moines with your vaudeville show, there might be one slot reserved for like the best Des Moines talent who could come onto the stage. And if you were great, maybe they'd pick you up and take you with you on the circuit and back to Manhattan to sort of become a star. So understanding vaudeville as like you can connect vaudeville to social media popularity. Like vaudeville artists would go viral in this like kind of tiny turn of the last century way. And then they, would have their pictures and papers all across the country and everybody would love them. And, maybe they'd have 5 minutes of fame and, they could tumble if they did something bad in the press. But so vaudeville was super important to the sort of structure of how we think of theater and arts performance today. And one thing that oh gosh, we only have 2 minutes left. I heard a great comment on the similarity between vaudeville and TV today in the way that you change the channel is kind of like a new performer all of the time, and that American sensibility for consuming art and humor is very much about variety. I want something new now. I want sports. I want TV. I want a kid dancing. I want a cat doing something funny. And now, is somebody surfing, competitive surfing? That's great. We're very used to this kind of consumption of variety. Oh man, was going to get through so many more of these. Let's do just sort of one. Let me do 2 more slides and I'll let you go. So at the same time that this kind of musical theater vaudeville review stuff was happening, also what was called the legit theater, which is normally the like word forward, literary forward theater, ideas forward, philosophy forward ideas about theater were also sort of developing. So around the same time, the Pulitzer Prizes got sort of created in 1918, and the first Pulitzer Prize for theater went to this play called Why Marry, which was basically a play about what they called in the 20s the women problem. Why should we marry in a feminist time? Unfortunately, Jesse Lynch Williams was a man, even though that name sounds like it might be a woman. But sort of dealing with difficult issues, this thing that I call the agon, a complicated agon, became a part of kind of American theater in the 1920s. Abby's Irish Rose was one of the longest running non-musicals ever. It was a very racy play about an intermarriage between a Jewish person and an Irish person. It was very racy for the time. I think that poster is probably anti-Semitic. Just based on some of those characterizations, but this was very progressive for the time. It was a very progressive play for the time. So theater got better in the 20s in general. The quality of the content, the sort of ideas that were being messed with and sort of brought to light. And part of that was because of the Great Migration. So the Great Migration of African Americans from sort of from the South in general up to specific and selected cities in the North was basically the spread of an incredible amount of just powerful culture, specifically African American culture, but also the already hybridizing American culture of the US South. And as people in the US South, I don't think it's possible for us to be too proud of how much American Southern culture has impacted the entire country and the entire world. When they talk about art forms that are completely and distinctly American that have been developed here and nowhere else, some of the art forms that they talk about are blues, jazz, tap dancing, a musical theater. The specific musical theater that we have, these are all sort of like forms that came out. Obviously later on we have funk, soul, hip hop. So many of these things had like southern bases. But the Great Migration sent a whole bunch of talented, creative, a whole bunch of people in general, but many of whom were creative, talented, artistic African Americans, specifically to Harlem. The Harlem Renaissance sort of began partially because of that Great Migration. Here's a theater up in Harlem. So Harlem, you follow Broadway, you keep going up. If you take the A train, you're going to get to Harlem. The Renaissance Theater was one of the reasons why the Harlem Renaissance got that name, was because also of this theater. Down there in the left is this amazing queer jazz singer, performer, entertainer named Gladys Bentley, who I really love. So this really helped obviously push forward African American theater. So just I will let you go because I don't want to keep you any later. But two of the very first sort of really important pieces on Broadway that can be considered in the African American theater canon were this musical called Shuffle Along, which maybe you're surprised based on the title, maybe you're not, was definitely written for white people, written and directed by white people, but it was an all African American cast, and it was the first time that an African American love story had been taken seriously in the American theater. So prior to that, if you had two black people falling in love, it was a joke and it was sort of a vaudeville punchline. This is the first time that there was a true love story performed, and it was a big hit, and it toured around the country on those same vaudeville circuits. Appearances was a play in 1925. It was not a musical; it was a straight play. It was the first three-act play by an African American playwright on Broadway. It did very, very well, and that was the first integrated cast that was ever on Broadway. And basically, they just did it. It was like vaguely against the culture to be integrated, but they just did it, and then nobody complained, and then having integrated casts started being a thing. So I'm going to stop on Showboat. Showboat was a huge deal. Showboat sort of revolutionized a lot of things in the American theater. And one of the things it's often credited with is integrating the American theater. But I want to be like, no, dude, actually, this guy's show already had done that. But because he did that, it made it possible for the sort of big, glamorous Broadway shows to start integrating. So Showboat is called the first integrated musical, and that word means two things. One, it means Black people and white people sang together on stage and shared the spotlight. And the other thing integrated means is it means that the story and the music were integrated all the way through, and that it went back and forth from song to book, from the characters developing through music to the characters developing through scenes. Okay, I'd hope to get farther, but next time we will come back and I'll start at Showboat. If you have any questions, you can stay late and talk to me about them. Otherwise, class is over, so peace out, and I'll see you in a week. Bye.
Hey, are you having
Hello.
office hours?
Yes.
Okay, sweet. Sorry,
I
I'm gonna
could.
go to my room real quick.
Okay, we could have them now, or you could come back in 10 minutes, whatever.
I would love to just have them now if that's okay.
Yeah, that's fine. Yeah. I totally thought I was going to get through much more of that slideshow. Like, oops.
I feel like it always happens that way whenever I present anything. I get so into it and then I'm like, where did
Yeah,
the song go?
yeah.
Okay, I'm in the quiet. Sorry about that.
No, that's fine.
It's hard. We have someone visiting this week, so there's 6 of
Oh,
us here, and I'm like, oh my gosh.